few weeks at a time, you can do that, but not for the long haul. Those days are gone, definitely. Also, controlling the seas is understood to be more important than fortifying the coast. So what I mean is that there's one strategist, one American strategist by the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan. He almost single-handedly brings the field of naval strategy up to date after the Civil War. So he saw that economic strategy could be just as important as military strategy. And with the blockade of the Confederacy, we see that controlling the sea grants the power to control trade, and it controls the resources needed to wage war. So Mahan pushes the concept of the big navy, where defense is achieved by controlling the seas instead of fortifying the coasts. And these theories contribute to naval arms races that you see at the end of the 19th century. So any other thoughts on the changes of the military after the Civil War?
I think you covered it very well there. But yeah, definitely on the tactics and just the way that the armies marched. If you watch, again, here we go with movies. I got to work a movie into every episode. It's a rule. But if you watch movies like Gettysburg and like Glory, where you see the Civil War, or even documentary or reenactors, you see how the lines of men are just all like jammed together. People are marching shoulder to shoulder, and when they march along, like when they're marching from one place to another, they're marching in a column of four across. And then when they get into battle formation, there's usually two lines, one in front and one behind. They're all just jammed together. That goes away. When you watch, like I just got through watching the Ken Burns series on World War II called The War, which is very good too. And when you see those soldiers going into combat, you see them, they're often running or at least walking quickly. They're spread out. They figured out after this war that it's not a good idea to have it to where one cannonball can take out 20 guys, right? But yes, so it's definitely tactics are going to change, although they don't change everywhere. We see in World War I, you still see a lot of frontal assaults against entrenched positions. It's almost like Europe doesn't learn the lesson of the Civil War. Entrenchment, like you said, is extremely important. And we mentioned earlier that you get these, over time, you develop these really elaborate networks of trenches. And as ironclads, that's definitely a major issue. Wooden ships are going to be pretty much gone within a decade or two. And yeah, all these changes, huge military changes that come out of the Civil War for sure.
Then in terms of technology, the changes that happen are also very important. The first have to do with medicine and healthcare. We talked about how horrific it must be because in the Civil War, if you're fighting, if you get hit by a mini ball, which tears up the flesh, oftentimes the recourse is amputation. And the technology to kill had advanced, the technology to heal had not. It's almost like the Civil War, it's the last gasp of the Middle Ages, where on each side when the war begins, you have puny squads of physicians. Maybe they were trained by a textbook, maybe they weren't. But after 4 years, when you have so many casualties, hundreds of thousands of casualties of war, you have legions of field-tested doctors who have studied anatomy, understand surgical practice, anesthesia, and they're still dealing with crude weapons. But when they amputate, it's not as though they just have a crude hacksaw. They do have saws, but they're remarkably precise how well they can conduct these procedures. They typically have ether or other whatever they could use to knock people out. The nation's first ambulance corps is developed here to rush wounded soldiers to battlefront hospitals. So you're not just leaving men on the field for days. Using wagons and deployed for that purpose are developed during the Civil War. So you collect wounded soldiers from the field, take them to a dressing station, and transport them to the field hospital. Doctors also change how these field hospitals are organized. They lay out these hospitals as camps, and they're divided into different wards, such as surgery and convalescence. So you have medical staff who are trained to perform different duties. And women flock to serve these hospitals as nurses as well, which also has long-term social changes with women entering the healthcare fields. Also, with the massive growth of hospitals and how they're organized, before the war, most people receive healthcare at home. After the war, hospitals adapt from the battlefront model, and this crops up all over the country. So you do have some famous figures before the war, like Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War. And you mentioned the name of this woman. I forget it in the Civil War. She's famous as a nurse. What's her name, James?
Clara Barton.
Thank you. That's it.
Yeah, she goes on to found the American Red Cross later. Yeah.
Yeah, so sadly, America has a lot of experience with how to deal with combat wounds at this period, and thankfully it applies these lessons to future issues. So you just don't have the hell. I can't imagine how hellish it would look to see thousands of men on a battlefield dying of wounds, seeing sepsis come in, but they're reforming that for the next war, which is good. Technological change. I won't mention much about military technology. I mean, we've mentioned ironclads and repeating rifles, which is another step in evolution from the rifled musket, far faster in reloading speed than muzzle loaders. In terms of other miscellaneous technology, I mentioned dog tags. So if you're killed on the field, people know who you are because there's so many people who die on the field. Hot air balloons for aerial reconnaissance. This appears in the Civil War too. Wouldn't be one of those that they're shot out. Landmines appear as well. Explosive technology is becoming quickly miniaturized.
Let me jump in. In real quick if I could on the rifles. Don't forget about the machine guns too. Machine guns make their debut with the Gatling gun. Although they didn't play a huge role in the war. They were barely even used at all. But they obviously are going to have a big future and a huge impact on warfare going forward.
Right. That's for World War I. In the Civil War, you saw how deadly it is to do a charge. In World War I, it is absolutely suicidal. But there's not much else you can do. So you're either sitting on your haunches for a long time in the trench or charging, and we'll see. The big one is telegraphs. I'm a scholar of the 19th century. I hate to use that term. It sounds so pompous, but people just cannot appreciate how shocking the telegraph is. This is the first time in humanity where instantaneous communication is possible. Before that, you'd have, I guess, carrier pigeons. And there are innovative techniques where in the Byzantine Empire, you have signals using fire, like what you would see in the Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, where the message is the call for help quickly goes from Gondor to Rohan. So you have primitive versions of that, but a telegraph, it's shocking. You can instantly communicate over long distances. You can almost communicate in real time. It's text messaging. Okay, it's clunky, but it's as long as you have a trained telegraph operator there communicating in Morse code, it is no slower than text messaging. So there is a cataclysmic break between before telegraph, BT, and AT after telegraph.
Yeah.
So you have real-time communication about battle results, enemy troop movements, unit locations. You can manage a war from the chief of staff in a way that was unfathomable throughout all of human history until then. Lincoln uses the telegraph daily. He spends long nights waiting for news from the front. He wants to know exactly what is happening so he can issue orders to commanders. As soon as armies arrive at any location, they set up telegraph lines. Civil War soldiers grew adept at putting up telegraph lines since they did it so frequently. In conjunction with telegraphs, the Union military also uses observation balloons to watch battles, monitor enemy troop movements. These movements are then relayed to ground commanders who then adjust their own troop movements accordingly or telegraph back to headquarters what they had witnessed. So telegraphs are a big deal. And then the last one I'll mention is food. Canning technology happens. Now, it doesn't debut at the Civil War. Napoleon is credited as being the first person to use canned food to feed his army. I don't know how accurate this is. And it's not perfected at this point. Well, throughout the 19th century, you have issues where food is not properly canned and food spoils or men get sick from eating spoiled food. But from the generals like McClellan, who might be poor as battlefield tacticians, but are expert at logistics, having canned food and feeding your army and transporting it over a long distance, again, to them would be as revolutionary as the telegraph, being able to provision your men. So today we have MREs, much fancier than the hardtack or the other food you talked about, James, in the previous episode. So it's not as easy. You can't just whip out your can opener or your Swiss Army knife to pop it open. They're difficult to open, they're heavy, but still you have portable food. So that's some of the technology that debuts in the Civil War. Any other thoughts on those things?
No, that's excellent summary of a lot of change, just a tremendous amount of technological change. And people don't normally think about technology when they think of the Civil War.
Right. Well, the last thing we want to talk about is social change. And if there's anything where the Civil War is still being fought, that's the issue today. And we started this episode with the whole historiographical debate that's still going on. Now, the first one is the most obvious. The Civil War ends slavery. I'm not going to say a lot on that because that's something that if people know about, they know about Reconstruction, they know about the after effects. So I don't want to get into that too much, but just for a couple of the bullet points with it, 4 million slaves are freed. This is a loss of $3.5 billion of capital in the South that is now completely worthless. The economic backbone of the South is built on slavery. Buying a slave is very expensive. Now that money is gone, and it makes the plantation system collapse. So great, enormous estates are divided into tenant farms that are rented to sharecroppers. So there's a form of exploitation that continues in sharecropping, but it doesn't funnel money the way that it used to with slavery. So emancipation, it severs the South from the institution that some would think it shaped its thoughts and its habits and the daily lives of both races. And in my series on slavery, I quoted a section from Booker T. Washington. Highly recommend his biography. But he grew up as a slave, and he talked about how there was a feeling of euphoria among slaves as when the days of emancipation came closer, and a Union soldier comes to the plantation where he is and reads the Emancipation Proclamation. So there's celebrating all night long, but then the next day people ask, well, what now? I mean, my way of life is gone and I don't want to be a slave, but what on earth do I do? So for the new freedman, post-war life is, really in the South, it's a nightmare. You're made a scapegoat by white Southerners who are angry with all that's happened to them. You have black codes, which is the emergence of Jim Crow. You're terrorized by hooded vigilantes at night. You know that you simply do not go into certain towns after dark if you don't want to be lynched. So that is something that is a legacy that does not end after a while. Okay, so other social changes. The United States went to war in 1861 to preserve a union. It emerged from the war in 1865, having created a nation. James mentioned earlier that the United States was used in the plural. The United States are. Now you say the United States is. And that's only a matter of grammar in the beginning, but it has important impact from how people conceptualize the United States. So the loose union of states became a single nation. And Lincoln's wartime speeches mark this transition. In his first inaugural address, he refers to the Union 20 times, but the nation not even once. But in his first message to Congress on July 4th, 1861, he uses the word Union 32 times and the nation 3 times. But by the Gettysburg Address, he didn't mention the Union at all, but spoke of the nation 5 times to talk about a new birth of freedom and nationhood. So just as an aside, a lot of the collective memory we have of the United States, of what it is when we think about it as a nation, when we think about the symbolology of America with American flags, a lot of this, some of it was there at the beginning of the nation, but a lot of it appears after the Civil War. If you read the Little House on the Prairie books that take place in the 1880s, where in Ma and Pa Ingalls' house, there's a picture of George Washington there. And part of this is an attempt to try to, there are attempts to foster sort of a shared ethos of the United States amongst all people. and the idea of the United States nation. So being a nationalist is something that becomes much stronger after the Civil War. And I mean, James, you're from